Good evening, District 4, and thank you for joining us for this evening's Budget Town Hall. My name is Malik Davis, and I'm a legislative aide to Councilmember Alex Pedersen. Councilmember Pedersen is here, and we'll get started soon. As you can see, we have a robust agenda regarding the city budget, which includes a discussion of policing and public safety. We currently have 150 people who have RSVP'd. Several have submitted questions, and we thank you for those questions. You bet we're going to have Councilmember Pedersen take questions regarding a variety of budget issues, including investments to address homelessness, revamping public safety, investing in BIPOC communities, transportation, which is the committee he chairs, and other budget matters. Thank you again for joining us. Councilmember Pedersen.
Good evening, District 4. I'm City Councilmember Alex Pedersen. I'm the City Council member for this district. Now, Seattle has 7 City Council districts. Each is home to about 100,000 people. Here in District 4, we have about 20 neighborhoods stretching from Eastlake to Wallingford to Magnuson Park. And our district includes parts of Maple Leaf and Wedgwood also. Under the City Charter of Seattle, you also have 2 at-large or citywide council members who represent you. That's Lorena Gonzalez, who is our City Council President, and Teresa Mosqueda, who is the chair of our very important Budget Committee. I'd first like to thank you for joining me and your District 4 neighbors tonight, and what I hope will be an informative discussion regarding the Mayor's 2021 budget proposal. Now, while the media often reports on the conflicts at City Hall, there is consensus that our city is facing multiple crises at the same time. The COVID public health pandemic, back-to-back budget deficits, the sudden failure of the West Seattle Bridge, stranding 100,000 of our neighbors, the wildfire smoke and other evidence that we are behind in addressing climate change, and a civil rights reckoning that reinforces the need to revamp public safety and invest more in marginalized communities so that we finally address institutional racism and truly achieve community wellness. Our city budget is a key way that we try to address the priorities and challenges facing our city. Our city budget collects and spends approximately $6.5 billion for the year. That's B for billion. The $6.5 billion includes Seattle City Light, Seattle Public Utilities, transportation, and other capital projects, as well as a $1.5 billion general fund that is more discretionary. While budget season officially kicked off Tuesday, September 29, when Mayor Jenny Durkin transmitted her budget proposal for 2021, your city government has been working on this budget for months, with each of the mayor's department heads in her budget office determining how best to invest tax dollars for Seattle next year. Now that the mayor has crafted and submitted to City Council a balanced budget proposal, we have 2 months to review, obtain input, amend, and adopt a balanced budget for 2021. As is typical for cities across the nation, our city must adopt a budget that is balanced. Washington state law requires that we accomplish this by the first Monday in December. Due to the COVID pandemic, revenues fell by $300 million in 2020 this year, and are estimated to be $200 million short for 2021. These back-to-back deficits are forcing departments to reduce some programs and projects to balance the budget, even as the mayor's budget fully taps the new payroll tax. Because this is a budget town hall during budget season, we wanted to bring to you one of the key public officials who helped to craft the proposal. The City Budget Director, Dr. Ben Noble, will be with us tonight. Before we get to Dr. Noble, I want to acknowledge that the major issue and priority we continue to hear about from the public and that we must address is the need to revamp public safety. So tonight we are joined by the co-chair of the Community Police Commission, who has been advocating for police reforms and social justice for many years in Seattle, Reverend Aaron Williams. Reverend Williams is also a pastor for a community-focused church here in District 4. After we hear from Reverend Williams and Dr. Noble, we will address many budget questions tonight that you have asked. We have a good amount of time set aside for your questions. There are many ways to have input in Seattle's budget process, including budget committee meetings, public hearings, emailing our offices. We receive hundreds of emails every day. My team and I do read them all. In addition to those ways to have input, we also wanted to have this budget town hall tonight for District 4. So thank you again for joining us and for your interest in city government. So let us begin. We're going to have Reverend Aaron Williams here with us. And I do want to let folks know that first off the bat, that I agree we have to reimagine and redo how we provide and pay for public safety. I've reached out to and listened to a wide range of people from our District 4 and all across Seattle who share differing opinions on public safety. I've had conversations with the young leaders of the Everyday March, leader Nikita Oliver, New King County Councilmember Gurmai Zahalai. I've had conversations with Reverend Harriet Walden of Mothers for Police Accountability, Dom Davis of Community Passageways, Michelle Merriweather, the Urban League, and many other Black leaders who have been working for years for justice. Now, while I have not voted entirely for what King County Equity Now and Decriminalize Seattle and many other individuals are calling for with respect to defunding SPD 50%, I have voted to immediately provide support to Black-led organizations and to fund outreach to seek more input from BIPOC communities. This is only a start. As we work to disrupt institutional racism and invest more in marginalized communities, I hope we can improve upon the unsatisfactory results from our summer budget session and find more common ground to devote the necessary energy toward what I believe to be the #1 impediment to revamping public safety, the police union contract. I believe that 100-page contract is expensive, inflexible, and unjust. And I've been asking and will continue to implore my colleagues on the Labor Relations Policy Committee to redo that police contract. I want to welcome Reverend Aaron Williams for joining us tonight. Reverend Williams, thank you very much. As a starter, would you mind sharing with our audience tonight what your role has been on the Community Police Commission and offer some observations about the historic moment, Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of the wrongful killing of George Floyd and the calls for justice? Reverend Williams, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Pedersen. I appreciate the work you're doing and appreciate your commitment to police reform and police accountability. I've been on the Community Police Commission for almost 7 years now, and been working alongside Reverend Harriet Walden, also Prachi Devi, who is also a co-chair. And we are committed to police reform, and we're also committed to amplifying the voices of the community, in particular Black and Brown voices and voices that have been most impacted by police misconduct. And so I just wanted to share a few things about what we're doing as a commission right now. When we look at the history of the Community Police Commission and how it started under the consent decree. And I also just want to highlight the fact that we're still operating under that consent decree. Constitutional policing, we have not made it to our destination yet. We're still working toward that end. And here's some of the things that we're working on that I think it's crucial that your district is aware of, and that's, you just mentioned it, police contracts are very important. Police contracts are one of the keys to police reform. And when you're talking about changing anything from discipline, the discipline of officers to them receiving pay and what have you, it all comes back to contracts. And that's very important. So we're still working on that. The good news is that we're starting the process of negotiating the next round of police contracts right now. And we're hoping people like you, Councilmember Pedersen, can help make sure the city finally delivers on its promises to community and fully implements the reforms that were established under the 2017 Accountability Ordinance. We're also working on a state legislative agenda. We just published some changes we believe that need to be made at the state level and in regards to police accountability. And we just want to make sure that police accountability is strengthened statewide. And so you can look that up on our website, on the Community Police Commission website. You'll see that agenda and those recommendations. So I think it's important, you know, we're still focusing on police contracts as a major part because it's undermining the accountability process. And we just want to make sure that we do believe police officers deserve contracts, but it should not be undermining the accountability process. And so those are the three things we're working on right now: the state legislative agenda and police contracts. And the consent decree is still in operation.
Thank you, Reverend Williams. One of the things about the police contract is it's expensive, and we'd like to reinvest some of those dollars into marginalized communities. I know in the budget proposal before us from Mayor Durkin, she announced that she plans to invest $100 million in Seattle's BIPOC communities. What are your thoughts on that? How and where should these funds be deployed in your view?
Well, I mean, first of all, let me say this, that the Community Police Commission, because we represent various constituencies in the city, we have not taken a unified position on that yet. I just want to be clear on that. But I think one of the most powerful things about this whole process, this $100 million that it's being distributed, a promise to distribute it to BIPOC communities, is that it's empowering the community. It's approach from the bottom up, where we're giving the community to say, hey, this is what we need as a community in order to see a more beloved community, in order for us to balance the playing field in Black and Brown communities. So I think the strong thing about that, and we as the CPC are excited about this budgeting process, because it's giving the community a voice to say, hey, this is where we want the money to go.
Thank you. We've also, for months, heard very passionate calls, lots of demonstrations about defunding the police department. There's been a call to defund by at least 50%. That's pretty consistent. We heard that a lot at the public hearing that we recently had for City Council's budget. What are your thoughts on the defund concept? What would you encourage allies of all backgrounds to be asking the city to do differently with respect to our relationship with the police department? And you know, any historical context as well.
Well, thank you. Here's the thing about defunding, and again, CPC has not landed as a whole on the whole process of defunding, but the Community Police Commission believes in disinvesting from policing and investing in BIPOC communities. I think that comes from the realization that public safety doesn't always mean police for a lot of people in Seattle, but it means public safety is not just something that the police can solve. It's a community-wide collaboration. And I might also add that police officers are part of the community, and it's not an us against them mentality. It should be a collective movement. If we want our cities to be safe, we need to also just recognize that the police department is a part of the community. So when we say disinvest from policing, we know you can't do that without reinvesting in community. And there are some great practices going on all over the United States, and right down in Oregon, they have a program called Cahoots. And one of the things that this program talks about is, those who have mental health issues and mental health organizations. And we know that the history of Seattle, especially back in the 80s, there was a lot of funding that was removed, taken from mental health organizations and redirected somewhere else. And we've seen the repercussions of that. There are a lot of people who have mental health issues who are out on the streets now, who are homeless, and they need help. And so I think this Cahoots program that's being practiced in Oregon may be a good program for us, or some hybrid form of that needs to be implemented here in Seattle. And so I think that when we think about police reform, when we think about BIPOC communities, that we need to empower the community to come up with some of their own ideas. There's some things that have worked over the years, and we have removed financial funding from those organizations. And we're seeing the repercussions of that in some kind of way. We need to balance the playing field. I don't think that police officers were ever intended to be everything to all people. There are some gifted men and women in our communities who have expertise in helping to bring about a more beloved community where we respect Black and brown people, where we respect all people, and that we're aiming toward public safety. So I think it's important that we begin to redirect those funds toward people who have the expertise to make the community better.
Thank you for that. We have, it does seem like there is growing consensus to have alternatives to the traditional 911 system, where we don't want to have armed officers showing up to a lot of these incidents, and it's not going to produce a good outcome. And we're asking officers to go into situations that they're not well equipped for, and they can create additional dangers and harm to others. We've seen people killed by police officers who are having a mental health crisis when we should have sent somebody there who didn't have a gun. And so I know we are looking at the Cahoot system from Oregon. I think there's one called STAR in Denver, Colorado, and it's similar. So thank you for that. The Community Police Commission last year submitted to the City Council a set of recommendations about what cities should be looking at in their next round of negotiations with the Seattle Police Officers Guild, SPOG, or the police union. I know we have some accountability measures and institutions already with the Office of Inspector General, the Office of Police Accountability. I know there's some talk about moving the Office of Police Accountability completely out of the police department for complete independence. In terms of what CPC or Community Police Commission was looking for, are there any other details that you want to talk about there, about what you recommend that the Labor Relations Policy Committee, which is made up of city council members as well as executive branch officials, are there any specific recommendations you would want to flesh out or highlight?
But one of the things that the CPC is recommending is that there is an independent technical advisor, someone who could be at the bargaining table, someone who has the expertise, who knows who knows the lay of the land. And so we're highly recommending an independent technical advisor that's selected by the CPC, the OPA, as well as the OIG, to be a part of the city bargaining team. This is a person that we can have faith in, and I think when we do that, it restores trust back to the community. Can say, okay, we believe that this system is operating in good faith. We believe that if we have an advisor at the table that we can stand behind, that someone who can kind of argue our case. And so I think that's one of the main pieces of this legislation and this bargaining agreement and the consent decree, all of this is interrelated. And the CPC is not alone. We have the Office of Inspector General, we have the OPA, and so we're all working collectively toward police reform. And we're all in conversation on a weekly basis where we're talking about these issues. And I think it's important that, that we understand also that there are other community partners who are working with us and who have come with these recommendations as well. And Councilmember Pedersen, you have talked to many of these individuals who are basically saying the same thing that we're saying. And I think it's so important that when you're serving in a public office, and at the end of the day, police officers are public servants. They don't operate in isolation. They're here to serve and ensure that public safety is a reality for all people, especially BIPOC communities. And so I think it's important that we especially in District 4, that District 4 serves as an advocate for BIPOC communities, that they listen to the voices of Black and Brown people so that this community, BIPOC communities can be just as safe as District 4 communities. So I think that's of utmost importance that we really get a hold of that and be an advocate for those communities.
Thank you, Reverend Williams. I know that during this budget process and during the contract negotiations, we'll hope that the Community Police Commission stays very close and provides that accountability for those in the negotiating room and for those who are like myself who are helping to put together this budget. And for folks who are listening, we talked a lot about police reforms and the long effort to reform the police department. I want folks to know that I recognize that that's not enough, that we have to redo the police contract. We have to reinvest in BIPOC communities, that reforms, when this is all over, there still will be a police department, even if it ends up being smaller. And we want to make sure that police department is fully reformed. And the contract is an impediment to that with their disciplinary system for officers, allowing a very complicated arbitration system, which doesn't give the public a lot of faith and trust in that it's going to bring justice. So, and then thank you, Reverend Williams, for also mentioning your efforts at the state government level. We really hope the state legislators provide that baseline of reform so that when we're at the city and county governments, we're not having to negotiate for the reforms. I was talking to King County Councilmember Gramai Zahalai about, when they negotiate with King County sheriffs, wouldn't it be nice if the state law were to provide a stronger baseline of reform so we can negotiate things like pay and healthcare and working conditions, not try to negotiate for reforms, and then save money so that we can then reinvest that money in marginalized communities. Reverend Williams, thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you're able to stay for the rest of it. We're going to have a presentation from our city budget director, and then we're going to take, Malik is going to ask some questions from the audience, mainly about the budget, I think, but if you please, you're welcome to stay. And I appreciate your dedication to advancing things here in the city of Seattle.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to shift over to our city budget office, to our director, Dr. Ben Noble. So he sets up his presentation and he goes ahead and shows that. We're going to have a little PowerPoint presentation. We'll run through it pretty efficiently so we can get to the questions. I'll just provide some initial impressions of the mayor's budget. So the mayor's, as I said, she's put together a budget. She's given it to the city council. We're working our way through it. It's an operating budget and a capital budget. And considering all the crises that we are facing, including the back-to-back deficits, I believe Mayor Durkin and her team have put forward a thoughtful and responsible, balanced budget. I hope my colleagues on the city council consider it in a collaborative and constructive manner. There will be lots of discussions and questions and criticisms and amendments of the budget which is normal during these next 2 months. I'll highlight one of the things I noted here just to flag it, is that there are some pay raises that are scheduled to go into effect for city government employees. And during the budget crunch, when we're trying to invest more in BIPOC communities, we're trying to address those who are experiencing homelessness and then even infrastructure issues like our bridges, having to close the West Seattle Bridge and the need for bridge maintenance, which we found from the city auditor's report that our bridges are in sad shape. Is this really the time for pay raises? And I'm thinking it's probably not. That would require negotiating with several different labor unions. But I did want to just sort of flag that. That's one thing that I noticed, but I certainly understand why the budget was put together the way it was. So Dr. Noble, thank you for being here tonight, and please run us through your presentation on the complex budget.
Thank you, Councilmember. Pleasure to be here. This presentation covers kind of 3 general topics. One is a little bit of what I might call Budget 101, just to kind of level the playing field for everyone, give you a high-level view of the city's budget. Then I was going to talk some about the impacts that the COVID pandemic has had on this year's budget, on our 2020 budget. We've been forced to pivot pretty quickly as the economic impacts of COVID have hit hard and sharp, if you will. And then I was going to move on and talk a little bit about the budget that the mayor just transmitted to the council at the end of September. That is the budget for 2021, so next year's budget. But the COVID is obviously kind of an overwhelming and underpinning element to all of this. Let me start with just kind of some basics about the city's budget. Overall, the city's got a budget of about $6 billion, actually closer to 6.5 now. And what this table does is try to give you a sense of what's included in that, because a lot of it is not necessarily the most basic government services you think of. So just kind of top to bottom here, the general fund, and we're going to come back the next few slides and talk a lot about the general fund. That's the really flexible part of the city's budget. The monies that flow into the general fund can be used for any government purpose. And I'll show you what government services are in fact used for, and the sources that flow into them. But the city's budget also includes the expenditures authorities for Seattle Public Utilities, SPU, from inside the city, if you will. And Seattle Public Utilities provides your water service, your charge for your sewer service, which is a combination of the city and the county, also your garbage. So all that's in your SPU, and that's your SPU bill, and those are paid through rates. And the money that you pay for those utility bills can only be used to provide those services. We can't use them to fund parks or anything else. Similarly, City Light, that's the electric utility, same way. The bill you pay to City Light goes to pay for the wires that run to your house, if you will, and the electricity that's being generated at the dams and other places, but we can't use it for anything else. SDOT, that's the Seattle Department of Transportation. We, of course, speak in acronyms like every good government. And that, because of the capital nature of SDOT's work, there's a lot of money that flows there. A fair amount of money from the state and from the federal government, depending on where we stand with some of our larger capital projects at any given time. So that's another big piece. Then there are a lot of revenue sources that are dedicated to specific purposes. Kind of the biggest one are the fees that are paid to the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections. That's the building department, if you will. But all the, if you get a permit to do a remodel on your house, or someone gets a permit to build a 40-story office tower, there are fees associated with that. And that whole system is self-funded. So the fees that you pay are designed to cover the cost of the employees and the overhead to provide those services. And then the last piece is actually a very important element, and is a big complement to the general fund. And that is the various voter-approved levies, and then also the Metropolitan Park District. So the voters of Seattle have been very generous in providing money through property tax levies for the library system, for Seattle Department of Transportation to provide some dedicated revenues there. We have the housing levy, we have an education levy. So those are important revenue streams to to help provide essentially enhanced services. So I do want to spend some time talking a little bit more about the general fund, because really, as the council takes up the budget and as the mayor develops it, that's where the most choices are, because this is money that can be used really for any government purpose. So just so you know, almost 80% of those revenues come from 4 primary sources, and they're about equal shares. Property taxes, so about 1/3 of your property tax bill goes to the city. The county, the school district, and the state also get pieces of the property tax, but the city gets about 1/3. Sales tax, so you pay about 10% sales tax, about 1% of that, so 1/10 of it goes to the city. The business and occupation tax, that's a tax on businesses, and it's a tax on their gross revenues, their total revenues, not their profits, but their revenues. And that form of that tax is dictated by the state. And then utility taxes, we essentially have a sales tax-like tax on your utility bill. The utility the rates that you pay to SPU for the water, that only is for SPU, but we also apply a tax, essentially a sales tax on that service. And that tax can be used for general purposes. And as indicated here, the rest comes from a variety of other sources. So what do we spend that on? So again, this is the most flexible dollars. And as you can see, half of it is spent on public safety. So that is a combination of the police budget, the fire department budget, and then also the budgets for the city attorney, the Seattle Municipal Court. And then I would also note the agencies or the entities that oversee the police department. So the Community Police Commission, we just hearing earlier from Reverend Williams, also something called the Office of Professional Accountability, which is another oversight function, and then the Office of the Inspector General. The next biggest piece here is administration, and I probably am not doing myself any favors by lumping too many things in there and then calling it administration. That is not all overhead. The city does have some basic kind of overhead-like functions. So I'm speaking to you from a laptop that is provided by the Seattle's Information Technology Department. So we have those kind of IT costs that every big company really does. But this lump also includes some of our smaller offices. We have an office for labor standards, an office for civil rights, and those are all contained in that one piece. The next biggest chunk is for arts, culture, and recreation. So that's principally the Parks Department and libraries, also arts and culture. So a significant share of the general fund is going to support those activities. Human services is about 10% of the total. That's the general fund side. The Human Services Department also gets a good deal of funding from the state and federal government. And in particular this year, because of the COVID issues, ever more money going through there. And then smaller amounts on neighborhood and development, and a relatively small amount on utilities and transportation. That piece is principally transportation. But again, that's only the piece of the general fund that goes to transportation. There's a lot of dedicated funding sources. There's a commercial parking tax, for instance, that is a dedicated source of funding for transportation. So that gives you a sense. Again, I'm just trying to give you a high level view of what makes up the budget and what we spend things on. It does highlight, in showing you just what a significant share there is for public safety, does highlight how important the decisions around the police budget are. The police budget is about $400 million, so essentially a quarter or a little bit more than 25% of this overall budget. So obviously a significant component and worthy of a good deal of discussion and consideration. So now I'm going to shift and talk more about 2020 and in no small part the COVID pandemic. A lot of numbers on this page. I'm just trying to be very transparent about the impacts here. So what's shown here is our revenue forecast for the general fund. So going to talk about that roughly. It's here. It's technically 1.48 billion. We rounded it to 1.5 in the previous slides. That was our original forecast. When we started the year, that's how much money we thought we were going to take in. We revised that forecast as late as August of this year, and we are now down below 1.3 billion. And you can see very significant drops in sales tax, in B&O tax, utility taxes, and also court fines and in parking. So we're until last month or so, parking meters have been off for about 6 months because there really wasn't very high demand. And we were trying to provide free street parking for essential employees. As the demand has gone up, we have started to charge at relatively low rates for the parking. But in any case, a lot of lost revenue. So you can see in total, almost 200, well, actually over $200 million, really, if you consider some of the other funding we need to backfill other lost revenue streams. So we were at 1.5 billion. We now have to manage a 1.3 billion, essentially, in terms of 2020. And at the same time, we've had to take on considerable new expenses in terms of responding to COVID. So, for instance, our shelter system, we've opened up new shelters, not just to provide increased capacity, but actually to reduce the density of the shelters so that people are appropriately socially distanced. That costs more money. The city is actually paying the initial costs, although we're getting reimbursement from FEMA for some of it for testing sites. So the drive-through and walk-up testing sites that the city has established are actually something that literally the city is doing. Normally would have thought of that as a state or a federal role. But we've also provided small business support using some federal money, and food vouchers using some of our own money as well as some federal money. So there have been additional expenditure pressures on the COVID side as well. In terms of how do we balance a $200 million hole? A couple of ways. One is we immediately went to all the departments and asked them to reduce their spending. In particular, discretionary spending on things like travel and training. To see that third bullet there, those have all been all but eliminated. We've also imposed a hiring freeze. We do have a waiver process, so we can be sure to hire essential employees. But the city is, as folks retire or separate for some other reason, we're holding those vacancies. Labor costs are probably about 75% of the general fund, a big chunk. So that really the only way to control spending. Not the only way, an important way to control spending is controlling our labor costs. We've also been reprioritizing some of the capital resources. I mentioned the levies previously, particularly for SDOT and for the Parks Department. The levies were designed to build a lot of capital projects. What we've been doing is deferring those capital projects and taking the revenues that were to go in that direction and instead investing them in operations so we can support basic operations. An example for parks, community centers, we've been using as one of the places to shelter folks, to provide shelter services. It's also a place where we're providing daycare for folks who need to be at work and normally would be sending their children to school, but obviously that's not an option now. So an example of some of the reprioritizing we're doing. We've also tapped into our rainy day and emergency funds. Initially for 29 million is indicated here. More recently for about another 25 million to provide more COVID relief. We went into the pandemic with about 128 million in our reserves. By the time the proposed budget for 2021, in addition to the spending here in 2020, proposed budget in 21 will spend all but 5 million of that. So we are going to run down our reserves. Our forecasts show us beginning to grow out of this, actually to begin next year, but to be more robust in 2022. So it's not entirely comfortable to use those reserves, but we do feel it's really necessary to maintain services that we want in the context of less revenue. And then as indicated here, in terms of COVID response, we've been very aggressive in looking at federal resources. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is helping to reimburse for some of our significant costs. But we've been looking for every source that we can and have had success both the state and federal level. So that's 2020 and the major steps we've taken there. Talking about 2021 now, again, to shift to more about the process that is underway. And this gives you this graphic's trying to give you a basic calendar of that process. So we were working, just as the pandemic was hitting, we were working to prepare the first steps of preparing the 2021 budget. So we were getting inputs from the departments through the beginning of summer. Then over the summer, we were working within my office, the budget office, CBO, the city budget office, and MO, it's the mayor's office. So we were working closely with the mayor, We were completing both an analysis of the spending, then also developing a revenue forecast. We balanced to that forecast. And then we submitted the budget to the council as indicated here in September. And the council is now deliberating through the budget. They just had the first of their public hearings earlier this week. And they begin presentations from council staff next week. I know this process from both sides. I spent more than a decade working for the city council and a fair amount of time in this part of the process rather than the initial part. But then the council will adopt the budget right before Thanksgiving, and then it takes effect in January. So that's the process. Let me tell you a little bit about the budget itself. So it was a difficult climate to be building the budget. Obviously, we expect operational changes from COVID now to persist into next year. So for instance, we don't expect the Parks Department or the libraries to be fully functioning, certainly not sooner than mid-year at this point. I mean, if you're listening and reading the news, you'll see on the private sector work from home for some has been extended actually through September of next year. And we're expecting again a slow phased response. Obviously, that's unpredictable at some level, really based upon the public health issues. So in terms of the overall economy, when we do a revenue forecast, one of the things we do is to forecast the local economy, and the consensus kind of forecast now. But again, all dependent on what happens on the public health side. But general consensus is that we've seen the bottom of the COVID recession, if you will, and we're beginning to grow out of it. But it's been very slow, and it's also been very uneven depending on which sectors you're in. So service sectors, particularly for Seattle, tourist-based sectors have been hit particularly hard, and we don't expect them to recover that fast. Some ways that becomes a double whammy for Seattle because we have the direct effects from our own hotels and restaurants and tour companies and all the like. But then in addition, we have the impacts to Boeing because core parts of Boeing's business is based on travel fundamentally. And again, the forecast there is that industry will take a long time to recover. And Boeing just recently announced that it was consolidating production in South Carolina for some critical aircraft. So we're getting hit a couple ways in those sectors. A bit of good news in terms of building the budget was the new payroll tax that was adopted by the city council. That's a tax that will take effect in January of 21 and is forecast to generate almost $200 million, which helps significantly offset some of the revenue pressures that we've been seeing. So I showed you the revenue forecast was down almost 200 million for this year. This new revenue stream will help offset that. We again do have other expenditure pressures as well, and I'll talk about those. Another thing to know is it's not just the general fund that's been hit. You think about some of the other tax sources that we use for general government. We charge an admissions tax for things like movies and other entertainment venues. Those revenues are off precipitously. I mentioned the parking meter revenues. We also charge a separate tax for parking, for commercial parking. So if you go into a parking structure, there's a tax. People haven't been parking, so that revenue stream is down. So there's a lot of other places where we've had hits as well. As I mentioned, we're going to lean heavily on the rainy day and emergency funds, about $70 million. We expect to lean on those for this coming for 2021. So those are among the things that we're looking at in order to balance. The mayor approached the budget with a series of priorities. One is to sustain this response that we've had to COVID-19, both in terms of trying to contain the spread of the virus itself, so that the testing facilities, other public health interventions, but also providing financial and other relief to those most affected. So again, as I mentioned, expanded shelter services, rental assistance, food vouchers, grocery vouchers, all things that we intend to continue. Councilmember Pedersen mentioned this earlier and was talking about it with Reverend Williams. The budget includes $100 million available to invest in BIPOC communities. And we're doing that without sacrificing some of our base investments. We have an existing program called the Equitable Development Initiative, EDI, which is specifically designed to be helping BIPOC communities and others build wealth by investing in community projects. We'll continue that work, and there'll be $100 million on top. And the mayor has called for an inclusive task force process to identify how those resources are allocated. But the budget doesn't presume to allocate the 100 million, but leaves that to a collaborative and community-based process. I'll cover some more details on the next bullet in another slide, but immediately making some changes to the police department and building a foundation for a new approach to community safety overall. At the same time, we've tried to maintain, to the extent possible, critical services. So our Human Services Department and the various programs it provides have been largely unscathed, if you will. The fire department, they've achieved some efficiencies, but fundamentally we're not closing fire stations. Actually, because of the West Seattle Bridge is out of commission, we're expanding slightly fire service in West Seattle. Normally the fire system depends on being able to bring in extra crews for backup if there's a big fire. Because the bridge slows down travel, we've placed an additional ladder truck for tall building fires and an additional aid car in West Seattle. We started that this year, we'll continue it next. Obviously, homelessness and the housing crisis have not abated with COVID. If anything, they've been exacerbated. So commitment continues on that side. And the mayor's been sensitive to trying to maintain the city's workforce to the extent possible. A lot of dedicated employees. They're really the ones who provide the direct service that citizens and residents of Seattle enjoy. So, we're not able to guarantee everybody full employment all the time, but trying to be respectful of those who've dedicated their lives to working for the city. Probably more detail here than you need. I wanted to show you a little bit more about how the general fund was actually balanced. Once we add the payroll tax in, we actually end up with a forecast that's not far off our forecast for this year. We're back up to almost 1.5 billion. But there are a number of other pressures that are going to require additional resources. We have some money left. We'll have some money left from this year. That's the starting fund balance. As I mentioned, we're going to rely on the rainy day fund. So we'll spend about 1.5 billion, or actually more than that, 1.56 billion rounding up. What are we going to spend it on? Well, the city's base budget, just providing the kind of services that we'd hope to provide in 2020, will cost us 1.46 billion, that first italic number. The budget reduces expenditures, just the general fund side, by almost 64 million. There are other reductions in SDOT and in other departments. I'll touch on those. We're investing another $22 million in COVID relief, rounding up slightly. I mentioned the equity initiative, $100 million. There's additional spending on human services. Again, a lot of that is related to COVID, but not exclusively. And then there are other expenditure pressures. I mentioned that additional fire service in West Seattle. That's actually a $4 million bill for that. So that's how we've got to balance. That's why there are reductions. It's why the reductions aren't bigger than they might otherwise be. There are new revenues, both the payroll tax and then also the rainy day funds that are helping support our spending. Give you an idea of what we're spending money on. As I mentioned, continued support for COVID, rental assistance for $8 million. You can read this. Shelter providers, so they're able to establish social distancing within the shelters, grocery vouchers, etc. We're also adding $6 million to sustain expanded hygiene facilities and showers. So we, as part of, again, containing the spread of the disease and also providing appropriate living conditions for folks who are homeless. We've set up hand washing stations and have a system of mobile showers that we started to operate this year. This year, the federal government is helping pay for a lot of that. We can't count on that for next year, but we think it needs to be maintained. And I mentioned already, Parks and Recreation is using community centers for childcare, and we're also helping fund private childcare, parents who are sending their kids to private childcare, those who can't otherwise afford it. I mentioned the $100 million unallocated, but again, a mayor is proposing an equity task force to drive this, and then is looking for that same task force to make recommendations about how this funding could be sustained into 2022 and beyond. So currently we're proposing a 21 budget, but the mayor would like to see this sustained and would like to find a revenue source to do that. We talked about public safety, some things that are happening in SPD's budget. Immediately, the budget assumes a reduction in the sworn staffing and overtime. It's about a $20 million reduction overall. Same time, that's for that first line item, just in terms of reducing expenditures within the department. Same time, we're going to transfer the parking enforcement officers who are civilians from out of the police department into the Department of Transportation. The 911 call center, which is currently under police command, will be set up as an independent entity, as will the city's Office of Emergency Management that has otherwise been housed in the police department. So very clearly separating out functions that don't need to be part of the police department into separate units. At the same time, looking to reform SPD itself. So mayor's performed an interdepartmental team to review all the 911 calls and to identify, again, it's been talked about a lot, whether there are other ways to respond to what is now we send police officers to any kind of emergency. Might it make more sense to have different responses? The municipal court is restructuring its probation services to take a different approach that is designed to minimize folks' interaction with the legal system as much as possible and get them achieve justice and return them to a life without burdens from the court as quickly as possible. We're also doing some kind of creative things ourselves. So this year we established a service through the fire department that is designed to respond to folks who aren't having necessarily a physical health crisis, but may have a mental crisis of some kind or an emotional challenge. So it's a vehicle that includes a first responder, but also includes a social worker or someone who's trained appropriately. We've had success with that. So we're going to expand that and have a second vehicle available for those kinds of calls. Talk a little bit more about other ways that we've cut money. So again, I mentioned maintaining vacancies. Councilmember Pedersen mentioned wage costs or labor costs. So much of the city's workforce is unionized, and we have contractual obligations for pay increases for 2021. We've opened discussions with them about what possibilities there might be there. But for employees for whom there is discretion, the mayor has frozen pay. So, and that pay freeze applies to our managers, our executives, and what we call strategic advisors, some of our more senior policy positions. We continue to reduce and to the extent possible, eliminate spending on travel and training and consultants and the like. We're deferring some of our one-time investments. And then, as I mentioned before, we're also, again, for 21, as we did in 2020, going to take some of the levy resources that had otherwise going to be used for capital and direct them towards operations. Just a couple of specifics here. I'm going to talk about SDOT. Very significant funding gap overall, more than $80 million. They approached the reductions that are necessary to meet that. And that challenge includes taking on the West Seattle Bridge near term, which is in the middle of all of that, a very significant expense. So maintaining essential services, but they want to prioritize safety, trying to minimize impacts to underserved communities. And they are also looking to preserve the technical expertise they have in-house. So the largest impacts are going to be on the capital side. So they're going to shift resources to maintain basic operations. So there's some big projects like the North Lake retaining wall and something called the heavy haul network, which is related to the port, where we'll be deferring projects. We'll get back to them, but not in this crisis, not at the moment. There will be reductions in some of the in paving projects, as well as bike and ped and transit infrastructure. Those are the kinds of things we're always spending actually a good deal of money on. And we won't be spending nothing, but with reduced resources, we have to take it somewhere. Bridge maintenance has been a critical function. Councilmember Pedersen requested an audit that has identified that. So we'd love to be expanding funding here. At the moment, that doesn't seem possible, but we'll continue to look for resources that would make that possible. Next slide here is about Parks and Recreation. Again, another department that's hit relatively hard. Their revenue loss is about 40 million. And they similarly are shifting from capital to operating. And they are operating differently. So, and they're finding ways to save money as part of that. So this summer, they did not hire a lot of seasonal workers. The grass was growing longer than it otherwise would have. Some of the maintenance and cleaning didn't occur at the same frequency it would have. And they're looking for those restrictions to continue into next year, as I said. And some of the facilities won't be open. So for instance, only planning at best to operate 4 of our 10 swimming pools. Even if COVID restrictions come off, probably won't be reopening most of those in 2021. They're among the more expensive facilities to operate. Community centers are being used in a different way. So it gives you a sense, in the Parks Department, I gives you the last set of bullets here highlights, again, kind of the discretionary projects that we're going to postpone. Some of the major maintenance, things like converting grass fields to turf fields. It's a really good idea. We get a lot more use out of a turf field, but again, in the context of the crisis and lost revenues, this seems like the right kind of prioritization to be doing. Similarly, we'll slow down the development of new parks for a little while, but we hope to get back to all of this as the economy turns. So that's what I had to kind of give you a high-level overview, and I'm here to answer questions as necessary.
Thank you, Director Noble. Appreciate that. And we will make this presentation available later this week on our website. So that's another important point. If you need information about the city budget, you can go to Seattle City Council. You can navigate to my website and my blog. It has a lot of links to the budget documents, links to how you can participate and provide additional input besides just this town hall tonight, which is just one of many venues, one of many ways to provide input. So let's jump into the questions. Malik, why don't you go ahead and get started? I assume most of the questions will be directed at me, but if it's obvious something Director Noble can answer, or even Reverend Williams, but go ahead, let's get into the questions.
Absolutely. And to the audience, if you have questions specifically for the budget director or Reverend Williams, please feel free to send those through. We've got several questions here. Patty, Rudy, Eric, Bill, Lorna, Allen, Leah, Jasmine. We're going to try to get all these questions in. First, having to do with the increasing number of encampments in District 4, in particular around Ravenna and Olga and Cowan Park. Councilmember Pedersen, from Patty, what and when will the council start the new navigation team since it ended? Ravenna neighbors and those of us who live there would like to hear what's next and when, please.
Sure. So the navigation team, just for the audience tonight, those who might not be familiar with the navigation team, it's a team of city government employees from different departments who are deployed to engage with unauthorized homeless encampments throughout our city. It's been around for several years. There have been several reforms and improvements, iterations of the navigation team. It's become controversial when encampments are moved. A lot of people call those sweeps, and those are viewed very negatively. I believe that I've got a background in homelessness issues, having worked at the Department of Housing and Urban Development during the Clinton administration and in affordable housing before I was at City Hall. I think the navigation team is one of the tools that we need to have to coordinate our response. Several city council members would like more of the dollars to go to nonprofits to provide outreach. I feel that there are other things that have to be taken care of as well. There's trash pickup, there's removing of obstructions, there are fire hazards. The fire department is called out a lot to various encampments. So there was a split on the city council about what to do with the navigation team. The consensus was that we should try another iteration of it where we do not have police officers as a permanent member of the navigation team. So there was a vote to reconstitute the nav team without police officers, and we all voted for that. But then there was another vote that was a 5-4 vote. I voted against it, which was to defund that navigation team. And so there was another vote on it. There was an override. The mayor vetoed it. Then the city council overrode that veto. A couple council members, including myself, wanted to have that go forward because we wanted to keep the navigation team. So unfortunately, the navigation team has been temporarily defunded. And so what I'm hoping is that there is a compromise between the council members who voted to defund the navigation team and Mayor Durkin and her interdepartmental team. Because I really believe there needs to be a coordinated effort. In 2019, I believe there were about 450 unauthorized encampments that were moved, which was controversial, considered a high number. This year, since the COVID pandemic, I think there have been only 7 removed. And the navigation team has been spending their time doing outreach, removing trash, to the extent there is shelter available, connecting people to shelter. Unfortunately, with the COVID pandemic, the need for social distancing has required that shelters be de-intensified, which has made it really hard to have shelter space. Mayor Durkin and her team have found a lot of additional shelter space to sort of keep it a net neutral amount, but we need more. Ultimately, the solution here is more permanent housing, more permanent affordable housing, some of it with supportive services to provide help for those who need it. This housing first approach to homelessness is very important to provide that permanent place, the permanent home for somebody so that they can deal with whatever challenges they are facing, whether it's substance use disorder, mental illness, economic problems that they're challenged with. There is going to be, Mayor Durkin has put money in the budget for the navigation team to, it's a scaled down version. They're calling it outreach and response. I know there are going to be lots of questions from city council members about what that looks like. I think we do need to have that city government coordinated effort to complement the nonprofits that are out there and to coordinate with them and to keep track of the data, to remove the trash, to deal with the fire hazards. So I'm hoping a compromise can be reached. There is a temporary intervention that a lot of people have heard about called tiny home villages. A lot of people really like the concept of tiny home villages. Initially they had mixed results. They weren't exiting folks to permanent housing as quickly as many had hoped. The numbers did improve. And now with COVID and the need for social distancing, tiny home villages are a preferred choice of a lot of people in encampments, unauthorized encampments. So we are actually looking at adding a tiny home village in District 4 in the University District. And because we have one right now in North Lake area in Wallingford, the community has been very supportive of it. It hasn't had great results in terms of exiting folks to permanent housing. So the model that we want to have in the U District will have case management and we'll be tracking, if that is able to be stood up, it would be, we'd be tracking the results very carefully and making sure people are getting the services and help they need. But hopefully that will help with the unauthorized encampments that we're seeing pop up throughout District 4.
Thank you, Councilmember Pedersen. A lot of people have been asking about encampments and how we can be supportive of our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness. Second question, is there any aspect of policing that you would want to defund?
Yes, so I think it's important that we need to deal with the injustice, the institutional racism that exists. That's seen a lot with the disciplinary system, where if officer is accused of misconduct, there's a very complicated process to fire an officer and keep them fired. That is something we need to fix through the police contract. That's something that Reverend Williams had mentioned in the Community Police Commission, to fix the disciplinary system. In terms of, and that's going to be fixed through the police contract, for revamping that contract. The contract is also very expensive. So you've read reports about officers making, a handful of officers making $300,000. That's not acceptable. The The way overtime is earned is very loose within the police department. I don't think that contract it's a disservice to good police officers. It's expensive. So one of the ways to defund, there are going to be lots of ideas, and the council, a majority of the council wants to defund by a large amount. What I'd like to do is also to reduce these excess expenses that the contract allows for. There's premium pay, there's a inflated deferred compensation program, there's the excess overtime, and the way the shifts are structured, sometimes that leads to more overtime than necessary. So if we fix the contract, those expensive elements of the contract, that will free up money to pull out of the police department and invest in marginalized communities and other needs that we have throughout Seattle. So so rather than just chopping pieces, which the city council looked at doing in the summer, and then it's kept running into the contract, where the contract supersedes the city budget ordinances. So by fixing the contract, we can save money, reinvest it in areas of need.
Great. What would the status timing be of the Sandpoint Way project down at Magnuson Park?
So I'm assuming that has to do with there's several projects in that area. That's a very important area in District 4. Magnuson Park is home to about 850 low-income individuals. It's 69% BIPOC community. And Magnuson Park is also a regional asset as a park, and we need to invest in Magnuson Park. The community center is very important there. It's a structure that has not been getting the TLC that it deserves in terms of the physical structure. It also, the programming is not made widely available to the folks who live in the park. People are literally brought in from other areas to benefit from the play fields and the community center programming. And we've got to change that so that we benefit the low-income families there first. And so the Sandpoint Way project, there's several pedestrian improvements that will be made there. So there's sidewalks and crosswalks. So if somebody's coming out of Magnuson Park and wants to get on a bus and head downtown, it's very dangerous crossing the street. There isn't really good infrastructure there. And yet we just encouraged a major renovation of a housing project there and welcome people to live there. We need to have infrastructure to support them, and that means the sidewalks and crosswalks. So when there was a struggle with the budget deficit this summer, it was actually the Seattle Department of Transportation canceled that project, paused that project. And I think that there was a lack of understanding about what the needs are in that area and the low-income communities right there. And I think that's one of the benefits of district representation is I was very aware of the need there. And so I worked with my city council colleagues. We voted as a council to restore those pedestrian safety improvement projects. When we have another budget deficit going into next year, there was talk about SDOT potentially removing that project again because SDOT's revenue sources have decreased substantially. We were able to work with the Durkin administration to make sure that project moves forward. In fact, I think they're advertising to hire a general contractor to put in those sidewalks and crosswalks. So that project is moving forward.
Budget question. Is there a way to circumvent the requirement that the budget be balanced, especially in these times of emergency? This seems like a stupid law even in normal times, and we desperately need to spend our way out of economic peril.
I think that's one for me.
Sure.
And happy to take it. So the city, unlike the federal government, we aren't in a position to borrow money to fund basic operations. That's an unsustainable practice that risks our ability to survive financially going forward. But I do want to say that doesn't mean that the city doesn't. I mean, the way for us to spend more than we are taking in a given time is to borrow money of a form, and we do that for capital projects. And although I described that we are making a number of capital reductions, we are using debt. The way the city does debt is to sell bonds. So we borrow money and promise to pay it back, and commit your tax dollars, just to be very clear, to pay it back. We try to do that in a way that doesn't overly burden either our current budget or the future budget. And that's the thing that we want to be most careful about, is, making sure that we don't end up in a situation in the future where we have too much of our budget committed to paying off debts from previous years. So that said, I mean, the West Seattle Bridge is a great example. There's $100 million proposed to be spent on the West Seattle Bridge, a little bit this year, a little bit next year. And we are going to issue bonds for $100 million to cover that cost. We will then pay that off over the next 20 years. So we are using that as we are both addressing the clear structural physical need of West Seattle. But in some ways, that project is also some local economic stimulus. That's $100 million getting paid to largely local companies for things like, ultimately, I would imagine steel and concrete once we get to building it. But also the design work, and even right now, work being done on diversions. So the budget is balanced, but that doesn't mean that we're not purposely reaching to debt as a tool to help pay for some of our operations. And as I mentioned, we're also using our reserves, because it is, again, I think, appropriate, as described, to use the resources we have to address the crisis we're in now.
So it sounds like, Director Noble, that the budget proposal is being as creative as possible, stretching things, draining down the rainy day funds. I mean, there are extraordinary things that we are doing. It's my understanding state law also requires that we adopt a balanced budget. All local jurisdictions have to. I guess we do benefit when the federal government is able to deficit spend, and then they are, with the various COVID relief packages that came from Washington, D.C., that money has been funneled to the city of Seattle. Speaking in a partisan way, I hope that Trump is not reelected, and that we have a president that will see the needs clearly see the needs here, and that we get some more stimulus funding from the federal government and benefit from the deficit spending they're able to do in times of crisis.
In a less partisan way, I couldn't agree more.
Malik, what else you got?
Yeah, I think there's probably a question from a couple parents who have students at the University of Washington, the major flagship institution of higher learning that's in your district, Councilmember Pedersen. Question: what outreach are you doing with the UW students in this district, considering there's a COVID outbreak of over 215 plus students at this time?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. I know, even though it's not, necessarily directly related to the budget, I mean, this is something that we just, we're seeing the media reports about this outbreak of COVID in the University District, University Park area, Fraternity Row, 17th Avenue, and areas there right off campus. It's my understanding that there are about 220 new cases. It's coming from 15 different houses there, fraternity, sorority houses off campus. The good news is that the city is involved through Seattle King County Public Health. The public health officials are having direct contact with where the outbreak is occurring among those fraternity and sorority houses. The University of Washington administration is all over this as well. And so they are getting those students to quarantine. Public health, Seattle and King County have merged their public health departments, but the King County Public Health with Seattle, we are they're doing contract tracing directly with the students there. So they're directly involved, public health officials, University of Washington administration. Parents are getting involved as well. Parents of those students are getting involved. I really think that the students are going to listen more to those public health officials and the scientists and the University of Washington administration and the parents more than they're going to listen to the local politician. I do want to encourage students who might be watching tonight to wear masks, maintain social distancing. There is a testing program that's available as well that you might have heard of. Husky coronavirus testing. There is a website there that you can go to, washington.edu/coronavirus/testing. They're offering testing for all University of Washington students. So I would encourage folks to take advantage of that if you're living near that area, and if you have any symptoms or have come in contact with anybody, you can get that testing from the University of Washington. I put up something on my website about it too.
Coming back to a question about the police, can you please elaborate for the public exact steps you would recommend each to take to help put pressure on creating a new anti-racist police union contract that could be enacted as quickly as possible when the current contract expires in December?
Yes, thank you for that question. I know, during the summer, we were really focused because we were facing a budget deficit and we had to rebalance our 2020 budget for this year. The focus is really about the police budget and the fact that we're spending $400 million on the police department, and yet, there are peaceful demonstrations going on, and we see police who are overreacting in a lot of cases to these demonstrations, and people want to pull money out of the police department to defund and provide it for community needs. The contract is the major impediment, which was reinforced during the summer when council members tried to do more and they couldn't because of the police contract. So simply talking about the police contract, adding that to your, when you're passionately, pleading with elected officials like myself and others, please add that to the conversation. Mention the police contract. Just getting that out on the table is really important because there are 5 city council members who serve on the Labor Relations Policy Committee. They need to hear from you. They need to know that this is a priority, that the police contract needs to be fixed. It should not be an excuse for doing nothing else, but if we really want to make sustainable, deep reforms and to reinvest funding, the police contract needs to be dealt with. So add it to what you're talking with friends and allies about. Add it to what you're talking about with elected officials. Implore elected officials to take more time to focus on this. Also, the state government, your state representatives need to hear from you, because when they go into their next state legislative session in Olympia, they have limited time to deal with stuff. We need them to enact state reforms as well to increase the reforms that are just the baseline reforms, so we don't have to negotiate for those locally. Those are the things just right off the bat that we need folks to do who want to make this change happen.
Sure. Good. Moving on to some other questions. As a privileged white man, who have you consulted for lived experience in BIPOC communities in Seattle?
Yes, I want to acknowledge my privilege as a white man, and to know that I come to the job with blind spots and lack of lived experience for a lot of what oppressed communities have been facing. And during the civil rights reckoning has raised this, made this obvious. I've been reaching out for the last few months to Black leaders, trying to connect with a wide array of people. So the Community Police Commission, Reverend Harriet Walden, who founded Mothers for Police Accountability. She helped to start the Community Police Commission, talked to people in the business community like Jebediah Gardner, other elected officials like Gurmai Zahalai, the Victoria Beach, who's with the African American Community Advisory Committee, Dom Davis of Community Passageways, Michelle Meriwether, Urban League, and I really appreciate Aaron Williams being here. I know that he's somebody that we'll be able to talk to a lot through this process. The everyday marchers who have been to my house several times. One of those times I did walk with them. I did talk to them once through Zoom and then once in front of my house. Mark Solomon, who is a crime prevention coordinator here with the city of Seattle, who ran for city council. Andre Taylor of Not This Time. So I'm trying to reach out to folks throughout this process so that they're centered in this work.
Thank you. Thank you. You mentioned the everyday marchers. Will you publicly support the right of peaceful protest and condemn violence against protesters?
Yes. We have First Amendment rights. We have a right to protest. We have a right to march. And in fact, we passed a resolution. I co-sponsored a resolution with Councilmember Mosqueda to protect the media and medics and observers of these marches as well. That's a short answer. Yes, the answer is yes, absolutely.
But back to a budget question. Would you support adding funding for parks and recreation facilities and programs if it is safe to do so? I am concerned that many essential community centers, pools, library programs, etc., are not funded in the proposed 2021 budget. What happens next year from a budget perspective if it is safe for parks and recs to be more fully operational at some point next year?
Sure. Well, voters did approve of the Metropolitan Parks District, which is another source of funding for our parks. Now, it's a property tax, and I know there have been several property tax measures approved, and people, especially those on senior citizens who own a home, fixed income, it's very hard on them to have these successive property tax increases. We all enjoy our parks. We want to get back and spend more time in them. The community centers are anchors in the community. I mentioned the Magnuson Park Community Center. We need to do much more programming there for the low-income residents who live there, and also the capital needs of the Magnuson Park Community Center and other community centers. It's just it's because of this budget, these back-to-back budget deficits, that we'll have trouble finding the revenue to do that unless we were to raise taxes or have other progressive revenue sources from the state government. I mean, that's one way of getting at this, is if our state legislators were to give us more tools for progressive revenue, then we could potentially afford to backfill some of the cuts that we're seeing in terms of park and rec programs. Dr. Nova, I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
Yeah, I do think that if COVID abates and we're no longer using the community centers as shelters, and more specifically for childcare, I think we will have the resources to operate most of them in some form. several will be closed for some capital work that we'd already planned to do, and we reduced capital spending, but we haven't eliminated it. And another element is that once the system is up and running again, and people probably aren't excited about this, but there are a set of fees and charges that help bring revenue into the Parks Department, and they're being starved of that resource right now. And that's one of the reasons that they've had to rely more upon the levy resources for operations. So as things open up again, they will have those revenues as well. Again, I can't promise that we can open all facilities absolutely, but there will be there are resources that could help, and what the facilities that are now been redirected to COVID relief could be instead reopened for general purpose. And again, that'll depend on the public health aspects of this that are just so hard to predict.
Thank you.
Question regarding displacement and gentrification. What are you doing to reduce displacement and gentrification, Councilmember Pedersen?
So we have seen this in Seattle. We've seen this in the Central District, where communities of color have been pushed out with rising prices and costs, and there's a disagreement about how to deal with that on the city council. Some believe we need to have more real estate development to build more housing supply, and that will hopefully have rents go down and more people can stay. I'm skeptical of that approach. I believe that we need to build more affordable housing that's rent restricted, and not just leave it up to the private market to build whatever they want wherever they want. I feel that can lead to displacement. There was a interesting but controversial way of trying to raise more money for affordable housing by allowing greater density and height of buildings in certain more populated areas. So the urban villages, urban centers, the mandatory housing affordability program. So increase the density and then charge a fee for that benefit, and that fee can go to build more affordable housing, or the developer can build that housing on site, that affordable housing on site. It's not clear how well that policy is working. I think that what we need to do now is collect the data on that and analyze it and see, are real estate developers just writing a check and trying to get out of the trying to not build it on site? I would rather see more of it built on site. It's built faster. It's integrated into the community. The problem with paying a fee in lieu of building it on site is that it's not built for 3 years. So we would need to look at the data. As part of the budget process, one of the things that council members do is they ask a lot of questions, and under the time pressure of the budget and the need to get information, a lot of information is produced. So we will be asking questions about displacement. Are we seeing a net loss of affordable housing? There have been resolutions passed to keep track of this. It's not clear we're keeping good track of it. So we're gonna try to collect that data, see if we need to make adjustments so that we can prevent displacement. We want people who live here to be able to afford to stay here and not get pushed out by rising prices and costs. The other thing I want to talk about real quickly is, we sort of gloss over the utilities when we talk about the city budget. Each utility operation that we run is $1 billion. Utility bills are, by their very nature, regressive. So if you're a lower income family, you're paying a greater share of your household income for utilities, and because everybody has to pay their electric bill. And so you're paying a bigger portion. It's regressive. And so as chair of the committee that oversees the utilities, I want to make sure we keep rates low. And if we keep costs as low as possible for folks, then they can afford to stay in the city, so that we prevent displacement and gentrification.
I see we are coming up on our time for maybe 2 more questions. Is that okay, Councilmember Pedersen?
Yes.
Why should you not take the $100 million for BIPOC out of SPD's budget?
Yeah, so So the mayor made a commitment to invest at least $100 million in BIPOC communities. There was a new source of revenue that was adopted by the city council, a new payroll tax. I actually voted against that for transparency. I did not support that, but it's there, and it's coming from businesses in Seattle. Their payroll is taxed. And so I was not a fan of that because during a recession, I don't think that's the best tool to use. Nevertheless, there is an estimate that that's going to bring in $200 million. We're not sure if that's actually going to come through. We're hopeful that it does because that's what is being used to balance the budget now. Now, the city council passed a measure saying, well, this is how we'd like to spend the $200 million. That was a preliminary look at how we'd like to spend it, but I think council members feel strongly about that. The budget was presented to us balanced and using the full 200 million and investing 100 million in BIPOC communities. So I think that there's some who think that 100 million should come out of the police department, which is, I'm assuming, what that question is about. So the police department budget's about $400 million. For me, I'm most interested in what are the positive outcomes we're trying to achieve. We want to have justice within our police department. We want to have an anti-racist police department. We need to fix the disciplinary system. I think that if we fix the police contract, that dollars will be saved that we can reinvest. I don't know if that's going to be another $100 million. I don't know if that's appropriate. I'd rather just focus on the positive outcomes to achieve effective policing that's constitutional, that does not use excessive force, and save money where we can. I don't think we should be committing to specific numbers or dollar figures like that. The mayor has presented a balanced budget in terms of how to redo that. If it would, I believe, require the police contract to be revamped to save that amount of money. So, Director Noble, I don't know if you want to address that or not.
Just a couple thoughts. One thing, from the mayor's perspective, it was very important that there be $100 million to invest in BIPOC communities. That was in addition to and beyond the ideas around reimagining community safety. And what I would say as a budget person is that think about the response to 911. So I think it is apparent that we are going to find a model that doesn't have police officers, and I think appropriately so, if anyone cared about what I think, doesn't have police officers responding to every emergency call. But in doing that, we're going to set up some other system that has somebody else responding to 911 calls in some other way. And that's going to cost money too. So there is every possibility, and more than that, likelihood, almost certainty here, that what will happen is resources that are within SPD's budget, the police budget, will be taken out of that budget and reinvested in other ways to provide community safety. So the investment in 100 million doesn't preclude a deep analysis about SPD's budget, and that's actually specifically what the mayor is advocating. So she said, the budget is built on a number of officers, but at the same time, there's a team of folks, including seeking input from community, seeking input from the CPC ultimately as well, about how can we restructure SPD. And in doing so, as we do that, there'll be then the resources that would have otherwise spent on uniformed officers now redirected towards those alternatives. And there will still be $100 million to invest in BIPOC communities above and beyond that. So that's a different way to think about it. And it's certainly the way the mayor has been thinking about it.
Great. Last question actually was one of the first that we received. Your newsletter and blog expresses concerns regarding 911 response times. How have response times been this summer with a fully funded SPD? Could response times be improved by moving 911 out of SPD's control?
Response times are important to, and I know that especially priority one calls where there's an emergency in progress, there's a life safety issue occurring. It's my understanding that response times are were very low. I mean, part of that was due to COVID, where there's just less activity going on in general, which enabled the police department to respond quickly. So it's my understanding that the response times were relatively low during the summer, except when there were demonstrations. But the demonstrations, I think that would have just affected, might have slowed response times for priority 3 or priority 4 calls that are not emergencies. So I think that what we want to do going forward, though, is to understand how response times will be affected for any major changes that we make, so that if we're trying to save money and shift money out of the police department, will that mean that it will take longer for officers to arrive for things that officers should be sent to? I think we'll also want to have fast response times when we redo our 911 system, and we have like the program that Reverend Williams was talking about, like Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, when we have responders providing to mental health crises. I think we want to make sure those response times are low and that people get the help they need rapidly through a revamped 911 emergency system.
Good. That brings us to the conclusion of our questions.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I think Malik's putting up a slide here that you see the website. Please do go there, look for information. That website it explains, how I vote on stuff. It has links to other documents. There's I think on the homepage right now, it has the city budget information there. If you want to learn more, if you're mostly concerned about public safety and the justice demonstrations, just keep scrolling down. There's a very lengthy entries about what's been going on since May. I want to encourage you to continue to stay involved for the public process here for the budget. There is another public hearing on Tuesday, October 27th at 5:30 p.m. We have budget meetings throughout the week. People can call in to provide their comments during the budget meetings. If you go to my website, there's a calendar, there's a way to click in and find out when the budget meetings are, so you can call into those. You can email my office, alex.pedersen@seattle.gov. You can email all 9 council members at the same time. This is all information on my website on how to contact us throughout this process. I really want to thank you for your interest in the city budget, for your dedication to all the important things that are going on right now. I want to thank my team for preparing for tonight and all the hard work they do. I want to thank Reverend Williams for joining us, Director Ben Noble for joining us. Behind the scenes, we've got the IT folks and council communication folks who help to run the Zoom meeting. So thank you, everybody, for your time tonight, and have a good night.